The first time Walter Grady noticed it, he figured Buddy was just being a pig, nose to the dirt, rooting around like pigs do. But by the third day, Walter knew something wasn't right. The big Yorkshire hog wasn't foraging, he was digging, not just casually nudging at the ground either. He was tearing into the earth with a kind of focus Walter had never seen before, snout driving deep, hooves kicking up clumps of clay, forming a square-shaped pit with clean, deliberate lines. Every time Walter filled it back in, Buddy returned within the hour, tearing the same spot open with renewed urgency. Walter stood at the edge of the pen with a hot mug of coffee cupped in both hands. The morning sun spilled across the pasture, warming the brittle Wyoming grass, but the air still carried a bite. From the porch, Sadie, his old border collie, watched with flattened ears and a soft, uneasy growl vibrating in her throat. She'd always followed Walter wherever he went, but lately she wouldn't step within 10 feet of the pig pen. The horses, too, had grown restless. They gathered in the far corner of the field, heads low, tails flicking as if swatting away a bad feeling they couldn't name. "Buddy," Walter muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "What in God's name are you looking for?" The pig didn't stop. His sides heaved with effort as he drove his snout deep into the dirt, then scraped forward like something was calling to him beneath the earth. His body quivered with exertion, his flanks streaked with mud, snout raw and cracked from the repetitive digging. It wasn't just instinct. This was obsession. There was an urgency in the way Buddy moved, like time was running out. Walter had been raising pigs for over 2 decades, ever since he and Caroline bought the land and started the ranch after he came back from the army. He'd seen all kinds of behavior, sickness, aggression, confusion, but never this. This was intentional. He'd tried everything, shifted Buddy's feed to the opposite side of the pen, erected a wooden barrier around the hole, even left the radio playing classical music at night. None of it worked. Buddy tore through plywood and sound alike, returning to the same square of earth like it was the only place in the world that mattered. That morning, the digging stopped. Walter had just stepped outside, sipping his coffee, when he realized the pen was silent. Too silent. Chickens that usually clucked from the nearby coop were quiet. The breeze had stilled, and Buddy wasn't digging. He was standing perfectly still, his snout hovering just above the soil. Then, from deep in his chest, came a sound Walter had never heard from a pig in his life. It wasn't a grunt. It wasn't a squeal. It was something else entirely. Low and mournful, a drawn-out cry that trembled in the morning air like grief made audible. It was the kind of sound that turned a man cold, even in the warmth of sunrise. Walter froze. A chill ran up his spine as Buddy slowly turned his head and locked eyes with him. There was something in that gaze. Not fear, not pain, something closer to pleading, as if the animal knew something Walter didn't, as if it was trying, desperately, to tell him. Walter set his mug down on a fence post and took a hesitant step toward the pit. The hole had deepened overnight, carved with almost geometric precision. Dirt piled neatly along the edges. There were faint drag marks along the inside, like Buddy had been scraping not just down, but inward. Sadie barked once from the porch, a short, sharp warning. Walter didn't look back. He stared into the hollow, the silence pressing in, broken only by Buddy's slow, sorrowful breath. That sound still lingered, like it didn't belong in the world of animals, like it had been borrowed from someplace older, heavier. His stomach twisted. He swallowed hard. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" he whispered. And Buddy, just stared. Walter Grady's boots crunched softly over the brittle grass as he made his morning walk across the ranch. Steam curled from the enamel coffee mug in his hand, but the warmth did little to ease the tight knot in his chest. The sky was a canvas of pale blue, brushed with pink and orange at the edges, but the beauty of the morning didn't reach him. His thoughts were heavy, anchored not just in the strange behavior of Buddy, but in the aching quiet of the land itself. Everything on this ranch held a memory of Carolyn. The worn, split-rail fence he passed each morning was the first thing they'd built together after buying the property with their combined savings and a battered Ford pickup. He could still picture her sitting on the porch in her denim overalls, arms dusted with flour, reading some murder mystery while the bread baked. In the evenings, she'd sit beside him as the sky blazed orange, her laughter bouncing across the fields. That laughter had been gone 5 years now, but Walter swore it still echoed in the breeze sometimes, soft and fleeting. He paused near the sycamore tree she'd planted the first spring. Its branches swayed gently, casting long shadows across the pasture. He touched the chain around his neck, feeling the cool edge of her wedding ring tucked beneath his shirt, a ritual he performed every morning like prayer. He still wore both their rings, couldn't bring himself to stop. Buddy's cry from the day before still haunted him. That sound wasn't just an animal noise, it was grief. And now, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible lay beneath that patch of earth, and that his pig, somehow, was the only one who knew it. He turned toward the pen. Buddy was standing beside the hole again, not digging this time. Just watching. Sadie lingered behind Walter, ears back, tail tucked. Even she wouldn't follow him past the barn now. Walter rested his boot on the bottom rail of the fence, staring down into the pit. It had grown overnight, wider, deeper, too precise to be dismissed as random. The edges were near perfect, as if Buddy had measured them with intent. "Damn it," Walter muttered under his breath. He set his mug on a fence post and climbed into the pen. Buddy didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stepped aside with a soft snort, eyes never leaving Walter's face. The pig's silence was heavier than words. Walter grabbed a shovel from the barn and stepped cautiously to the edge of the hole. The soil looked wrong here. Softer, darker than the surrounding land, like it had once been turned and loosely repacked. He pushed the shovel in and felt it slide through the earth like slicing wet cake. Something wasn't right. The first few shovelfuls came easy, too easy. Walter's heart pounded harder with each scoop, though he couldn't explain why. The smell of damp earth rose up, tinged with something older, mustier. There was a hint of rot beneath the clay, faint but present, like an old cellar door cracked open after decades. Then his blade struck something solid. He paused. It wasn't stone. It wasn't wood. The resistance was strange, soft but firm, giving yet not collapsing. Walter crouched and began brushing the dirt aside with his gloved hands. His fingers trembled as they touched something coarse and fibrous, cloth, a dark, faded blue fabric, frayed at the edges but still recognizable as what used to be a shirt. He leaned in closer, heart hammering in his ears. There was something beneath the shirt. A pale curve. Bone. Walter sat back hard on his heels, the breath rushing out of him. His throat tightened. It took a few seconds for the reality to register, for the truth to claw its way through the denial. A human bone, not animal, not from some old livestock burial. Human. Jesus, he whispered, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cool air. He looked up. Buddy was standing perfectly still, just a few feet away, his snout tilted slightly, eyes locked on the unearthed fabric and bone. The pig's gaze held something that made Walter's stomach turn. It wasn't fear. It was expectation. Like he had been waiting for this, waiting for Walter to see. Walter stood slowly, dusting his hands on his jeans, breath still shallow. He stepped back from the hole and took one last look into the pit. His skin crawled. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them felt right. Who was down there? Why had they been buried under a pig pen on Grady land? And how in God's name had Buddy known? Walter climbed out of the pen on unsteady legs. He didn't remember walking back to the house, only that when he got there, his hands were shaking too hard to hold his coffee, so he poured 3 fingers of bourbon instead. He slumped into his chair by the window, staring out across the land he'd inherited, the land Caroline had loved, the land passed down from his grandfather, Thomas Grady, and now, a land hiding bones. "Buddy," he whispered to the empty room, "what the hell did you find?" The next morning came slow and gray, with a mist rolling in low across the fields like a veil trying to hide something best left alone. Walter barely slept. His dreams had been scattered. Images of Caroline's voice echoing through fog, Buddy's strange cry looping endlessly, and a faceless man in a blue shirt sinking into soil that wouldn't stay still. He awoke with a start, heart pounding, the taste of last night's bourbon still bitter in his mouth. He didn't bother with coffee. He grabbed his boots, a pair of gloves, and headed straight for the pen. Sadie trailed him part of the way, but stopped short when Buddy's shape came into view, crouched by the hole once again, silent, still, like a soldier on watch. Walter climbed into the pen and dropped to his knees at the edge of the pit. Buddy gave a low grunt and backed up slightly, eyes tracking Walter's every move. The soil had dried a little overnight, but the edges of the hole still held the clean geometry of something made by obsession. As Walter leaned in, the smell hit him again. Damp earth mixed with something older and metallic. Time. He dug slowly, hands brushing through the layers, brushing away the caked soil clinging to the fabric he'd uncovered the day before. A stiff collar, frayed sleeves, buttons crusted in rust. It was a shirt, canvas or work denim, the kind worn by men who did hard labor. Beneath it, bones, long white bones, not animal, not livestock, human. Walter swallowed against the bile rising in his throat. He had seen bones before. His time in the army had taught him more about death than he'd ever wanted. But there was something far more intimate about this. This wasn't war. This was personal. This was home. He reached out slowly and lifted the edge of the shirt, revealing more of the rib cage, collapsed slightly to one side. The skeleton had been laid in a fetal position, like someone had placed it there. Not tossed, not buried in haste, but hidden, concealed with care. As he pulled back another layer of fabric, his fingers brushed something cold and hard. A dull flash of metal peeked through the soil. He lifted it. A badge, tarnished and scarred by time, but unmistakable. A 5-pointed sheriff's star, faded but still legible beneath the grime. Sheriff Aaron Blake. Dated 1922. Walter's heart nearly stopped. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight settle into his palm like judgment. He'd never heard that name before. Not in the stories passed down around town, not in the histories his wife used to read aloud, not even in the sheriff department's dusty old gallery in town hall. A sheriff had vanished, and no one had said a damn word. Buddy snorted softly beside him and laid down, his big head resting on the dirt, close to the bones. He didn't move, didn't blink, as if guarding the remains. Walter sat back on his heels, his mouth dry. The morning air felt thicker, heavier. Something in the world had shifted. Something old and buried had opened up again, and there was no closing it. By the time the sun reached its peak, Walter had cleaned away enough dirt to see the full outline of the body: tattered boots, cracked leather belt, a rusted revolver partially sunk in clay near the ribcage. This wasn't a grave. This was a secret. And now it was awake. That night, after scrubbing his hands clean but still feeling the dust under his nails, Walter sat in the living room with a heavy photo album spread across his lap. It smelled like old paper and smoke. Caroline had insisted on keeping all the family records, even when Walter thought they belonged in a box in the attic. He flipped through the yellowed pages slowly, his fingers trailing over black and white photographs. Weddings, cattle drives, grainy shots of his grandfather Thomas Grady standing tall beside horses and wagons. And then he saw it. A photo from 1922, edges curled and cracked. His grandfather stood beside two other men, all in worn work clothes, squinting into the camera under a blazing sun. One man was big and barrel-chested, likely Levi Hart, Thomas's longtime foreman. The other was leaner, wearing a shirt identical to the one in the grave. Walter's skin prickled. He turned the photo over. In faded pencil, someone had written, Thomas, Levi, Blake. The last name had been scratched out with hard, angry lines, like someone wanted it erased from memory. But it was still there. Barely. Enough to know. Blake. Sheriff Aaron Blake. The man buried beneath Buddy's pen. Walter looked again at the picture, his heart hammering. Blake stood slightly apart from the other two, his posture stiff, like he didn't quite belong. The way Levi stood, arms crossed. The way Thomas stared straight ahead, unsmiling. There was tension there, captured in celluloid, frozen in time. He leaned back in his chair, holding the badge in one hand and the photo in the other, staring out the darkened window toward the barn, toward the pen, toward Buddy, who was still out there, watching over the grave. A pig had found what no man had dared to uncover in 100 years, and Walter had to wonder, what else had his grandfather buried? The next day broke with a sharp wind, whistling across the fields like a warning. Walter stood in his living room, staring at the photograph again. Thomas, Levi, Blake. The name scratched out still echoed in his mind, and the badge in his hand felt heavier than ever, like it carried a century's worth of silence and shame. He set both on the kitchen table beside his coffee, but didn't touch either. Instead, he stood in front of the fireplace, stonework older than the house itself, and stared at a faint crack running along the mortar behind the mantel. He remembered Caroline once teasing him about that spot. If your granddad was hiding anything, it'd be behind there, she'd said. At the time, he'd laughed. Now that crack looked like a whisper from the past, begging to be heard. Walter fetched a flashlight and flathead screwdriver. He wedged the metal into the seam, heart thudding as the stone gave way with a dry crack. A small cavity opened behind it, and in the dust and shadows, something brown and leather-bound rested like a time capsule. He pulled it out gently. An old journal, the spine cracked but still whole, edges curled and yellow. It smelled like mildew and tobacco. Thomas's scent, from what little he remembered. Walter sat down, hands trembling, and flipped it open. The first few entries were mundane: weather, cattle tallies, equipment repairs. Then came the ones that made Walter's blood run cold. September 10th, 1922. Blake poking where he don't belong again, asking questions about the shipments. Levi says he's getting nervous. September 12th. Blake got too close with that rail schedule. We need to act fast. The boy's righteous but stupid. Sept 14. Matter will be resolved tomorrow. Levi has it arranged. Pike says we'll be fine if we keep quiet. Walter closed the journal slowly, feeling sick. It wasn't just implication, it was a confession. His grandfather, the man whose name was still painted on the arch above the barn, had helped orchestrate the disappearance of a sheriff, a lawman, and Levi Hart, the trusted family foreman, had carried it out. He looked out the window toward the pen. Buddy lay near the hole, his snout resting on his hooves, eyes still locked on the spot where the bones lay. The pig hadn't dug again. It was as if his job was done. Walter took a slow breath and walked back out with a flashlight and the journal tucked under his arm. The air was colder now, the clouds low and gray. Sadie paced the porch anxiously, but didn't follow. Buddy grunted softly when Walter entered the pen. Walter knelt beside the grave and pushed his hand into the looser dirt on the far side, guided by a strange sense of necessity. His fingers brushed something hard, then metal. He unearthed a rusted revolver. The handle was cracked, one chamber empty. Next to it, a silver money clip, engraved with the initials AB and a stylized star. Walter stared at it for a long moment before tucking both into his jacket. This wasn't a simple death. This was execution. A cover-up. Buddy shifted his weight, standing now, silent and still beside Walter. The pig's breath steamed in the air, slow and rhythmic. Walter realized he hadn't felt this cold since his deployment overseas, the kind of cold that came not from weather, but from truth. He sat down on the edge of the hole and opened the journal again, skimming for more. September 16th. The rail line is cleared. Land will change hands by week's end. The law won't interfere again. September 17th. Paid Pike. Told Levi to keep his mouth shut. Blake's name won't be spoken in this county again. Walter let the book fall shut. He felt hollow. Everything, the land, the cattle, the buildings, it had all been built on this. A murder buried in the clay, a sheriff silenced for doing his job. And the silence had held for 100 years, until Buddy started digging. As Walter looked down into the grave, the fading sun caught the edge of the badge again. It glinted faintly, like a flicker of justice trying to break through. He looked at Buddy. The pig blinked slowly, as if satisfied. Walter didn't know what to say. He'd always believed animals were smarter than folks gave them credit for. But this was something else. You knew, Walter whispered. Somehow, you knew. Buddy grunted softly and lay back down beside the hole, his breathing deep and calm. He didn't look at Walter. He just stared at the spot in the ground where the truth had finally been uncovered. And Walter, for the first time in his life, wasn't sure he wanted to know what came next. 2 days passed, but Walter barely noticed the time. He'd stopped eating, sleeping properly, his mind consumed by the brittle journal, the name Blake carved into the badge, and the photo with its violently scratched-out truth. The revolver and money clip sat on his kitchen table beside the weathered leather journal like a shrine to a secret that had festered beneath his family's legacy for a century. Every time he looked at them, he heard Caroline's voice in his memory. Truth has a way of clawing its way out, even if you try to bury it with a shovel. Buddy had gone quiet again. No digging, no pacing, just resting near the pen like a loyal sentry. Sadie stayed even farther away now. Walter didn't push her. Whatever was unraveling, even the animals seemed to know it wasn't finished. He needed more. That morning, Walter drove his rusted pickup into town, the badge in his coat pocket pressing against his chest like a warning bell. He parked beside the county records office, a squat brick building that hadn't changed much since the 1960s. The woman behind the front desk, Marjorie, whose father had gone to school with his, raised an eyebrow as he entered. "Walter Grady," she said, setting down her coffee. "Don't see you around here much." "Looking for some old files," Walter said, his voice low. "Back around 1922. Sheriff records, land transactions, whatever you've got." Marjorie frowned but didn't question him. She led him to a back room where the scent of old paper and ink was thick in the air. For hours, Walter combed through brittle folders, yellowed land maps, and faded carbon copies of property sales. As the dust settled on his shoulders, a narrative began to take shape, one darker than he imagined. Sheriff Aaron Blake had officially been reported missing in September 1922. According to the file, he was last seen near the South Rail Corridor, supposedly tracking a livestock theft operation. The investigation had gone cold in less than 2 weeks. No body, no suspects, no follow-up. But that wasn't the end. Walter dug deeper, cross-referencing land transfers from the same month. A pattern emerged. Several large parcels, adjacent to key points along the rail line, had been purchased under shell names. Later, those same parcels were quietly transferred to men Walter recognized from town history. Men whose families still held seats on school boards, banks, and local councils. The most shocking transfer was the Morrison Ridge plot, purchased 3 days after Blake's disappearance by none other than Thomas Grady, Walter's own grandfather. The sale had been finalized with cash. No mortgage, no liens. Just a simple deed, signed and notarized under urgent circumstances. Walter's breath caught as he flipped through a folder labeled Unsent Correspondence. Inside, in fragile cursive, was a draft letter Sheriff Blake had written. It was never mailed. To the Wyoming Territorial Marshal, "I have gathered sufficient evidence to charge Deputy Levi Hart and Thomas Grady with collusion in the theft and illegal resale of livestock through the Southern Railway. I believe they are using Pike Freight as cover. I intend to execute warrants of arrest on September 15th. The date matched perfectly." It was the day before Blake vanished. Walter's hands trembled as he lowered the paper. All the pieces fit now. Blake had found them out, and they'd silenced him before he could act. Pike Freight. That rang a bell. He rifled through the documents until he found a shipping manifest stamped with the Pike name. And in that moment, everything snapped into focus. Raymond Pike, current police chief of Fremont County, was the grandson of Theodore Pike, the freight operator who had apparently helped cover it all up. And Walter had just found a trail of evidence that could scorch a century-old web of corruption to the ground. He stuffed the letter and photocopies into a manila envelope and hurried back to the truck. The sky had darkened, clouds gathering low as if the weather, too, felt the weight of what had been uncovered. At home, Buddy was waiting near the barn, not at the pen. The pig stood oddly still, staring at the old horse stable at the back of the property. Walter followed his gaze. The barn had always been a quiet place, mostly storage now. He hadn't stepped inside in months, but something in the way Buddy paced, short, purposeful circles, made his spine go cold. Inside the barn, dust hung like fog in the air. Walter passed rusted tools and forgotten feed sacks, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. Buddy padded behind him, and then, just past the hayloft stairs, Buddy stopped and began scratching at the ground, low and urgent. Walter kneeled and pried at the floorboards. They were loose, newer than the others. Someone had replaced them, but long ago. With a crowbar, he lifted the planks one by one, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. Inside was a wooden box, and inside the box, stacks of aged currency bound with twine, rail maps marked in red ink, and a folded piece of parchment with more names. Names Walter recognized not from history books, but from newspaper headlines. Senators, federal judges, railroad commissioners, and at the bottom of the list, Raymond Pike. Walter staggered back, heart hammering. This wasn't just about his grandfather or Levi Hart. This was bigger, systemic. The people who had built this county, their legacy had been bought in blood. He looked at Buddy, who was still standing at the edge of the hole, eyes calm, like he'd known this all along. Walter didn't say a word. He simply picked up the list, folded it into his pocket, and walked back toward the house with the truth heavy in his hands. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about now. The storm rolled in that evening, not just over the land, but in Walter's gut. As rain drummed on the tin roof of the old ranch house, he sat hunched at the kitchen table with the contents of the barn box spread out before him. Yellowing cash, hand-drawn rail schematics, and a list of names that should have been preserved in the halls of justice, not buried beneath floorboards like contraband. The names weren't just from the past. Some still held power. Judges, councilmen, lawmen whose children and grandchildren still roamed the county with polished shoes and clean records. Walter picked up the list again, staring at the final name, Raymond Pike. The Pike family had run law enforcement in Fremont County since before Walter was born. Theodore Pike, the freight man and fixer. Now his grandson, Ray, wore the badge. Same cold eyes, same family silence. Walter knew what he had to do. He called the only person who might understand the weight of this kind of truth. Nora Dunn, a local historian with a sharp mind and a podcast that had stirred up more than a few cold cases. She'd interviewed war veterans, miners, ranchers, and old-timers, always chasing whispers that others ignored. Caroline used to listen to her show every week, said she had a gift for digging into the past without letting it swallow her. He didn't bother with small talk. "I found something," Walter said flatly. "Something bad. Something real." There was silence on the other end. Then, in a low voice, Nora replied, "Is this about Sheriff Blake?" Walter froze. "How'd you know?" "I've been chasing his ghost for 5 years," she said. "Every lead I've found dries up. Witnesses back out. Records disappear. You just confirmed what I've always suspected." Walter exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. "I've got his badge, his remains, a journal from my grandfather, a box with names and money and maps, and Pike. He's connected." Nora's voice sharpened. "You need to be careful. 3 people tried to look into this before. One died in a car crash. Another moved away after threats. The third disappeared." Walter was quiet for a moment. "I already made copies, scanned everything, sent backups to a private drive." "Good," she said. "Because if Pike figures out what you've got, he won't come alone." That night, sleep never came. Around midnight, Sadie let out a low, warning bark. Walter flicked off the lamp and peered through the curtain. A black SUV idled at the end of the driveway, headlights off, barely visible in the moonlight. After a few seconds, it rolled forward, slow, deliberate, before continuing down the road. Walter didn't sleep after that. The next morning, He found the padlock on his tool shed snapped clean through. His backup files, the printed photos, even the rail maps, gone. But he hadn't kept the originals there. They were hidden in the grain bin under a false floorboard, wrapped in plastic. Pike might have come, but he'd left empty-handed. By late afternoon, Chief Ray Pike himself pulled into the yard in a spotless county cruiser, boots crunching gravel as he climbed out. He wasn't in uniform, just a black jacket and gray slacks, but his presence screamed authority. Walter stood on the porch, arms crossed. Buddy lay near the steps, head up, watching. Ray climbed the stairs slowly. "Heard you've been digging into some old family business," he said, his voice calm. "Folks around here don't usually do that. They know when to let sleeping dogs lie." Walter stared back. "Well, maybe I'm more of a pig man." Ray chuckled without humor. "Cute. But I'd hate for you to get hurt chasing shadows. You're not as young as you used to be, Walt." But he growled, low and steady. Ray glanced at the pig, then took a half-step back. Walter didn't flinch. "You ever heard of Sheriff Aaron Blake?" he asked. Ray's eyes narrowed. "Can't say I have." "Well, he's buried on my property," Walter said, his voice firm. "Under my pig pen, with a bullet in him and your grandfather's name in the journal that put him there." Ray's expression hardened. "You got proof?" Walter smiled grimly. "Enough to make a podcast. Enough to get the state attorney's office interested." Ray exhaled, the smile draining from his face. "You think anyone's going to care about something that happened 100 years ago? Think this town wants to tear down every building tied to that list of yours?" "I think the truth matters," Walter said. "Even now." Ray stepped forward again, a shade too close. "You better think real hard about who you're hurting here, Walt. Family names built this county, yours included." Buddy stood, muscles taut beneath his thick hide. The pig stepped between them, square and steady. It wasn't a coincidence. Ray backed off. "You've been warned," he said quietly. Then he turned, walked back to his car, and drove away. Walter didn't move. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. The walls were closing in now. But thanks to Buddy and Nora, he wasn't alone. The truth had been buried too long. It was time for justice to breathe again, and this time, no one would dig it back under. The day of reckoning came with no warning, just a sky too still, a wind that didn't move the trees. Walter stood at the edge of his porch, staring down the dirt road with a quiet steadiness. The world felt held in place, as if time itself had paused to see what he'd do next. In the distance, a dust plume kicked up. A vehicle, maybe more than one. Inside the house, the documents were neatly stacked in manila folders, each labeled and cross-referenced, copies in triplicate. Photos, maps, the journal, the badge. Nora had helped him prepare everything, her voice cool and professional over the phone, but with a current of fire beneath it. She'd coordinated with state investigators, a contact at a major newspaper, even a legal nonprofit that handled cases of rural corruption. "This isn't just history," she'd said. "This is a pattern, and it needs to break now." Together, they'd set the trap. Walter had sent word, carefully and deliberately, to Chief Pike and 2 other officials named in the barn documents. "Just a quiet meeting at the Grady Ranch," he'd said. "Nothing public. A chance to keep things from getting messy." He knew they'd come. Pride and fear made powerful motivators. By mid-morning, Buddy had planted himself near the barn, unmoving. Not the pen this time. Not the hole. It was like he knew something was shifting, like he sensed the weight of justice thick in the air. Then came the vehicles. 3 trucks pulled into the yard in a staggered line. Pike was first out, dressed sharp, sunglasses hiding his eyes. Behind him, Councilman Miles Kramer and County Commissioner Elaine Ward stepped down, neither speaking as they eyed Walter's house with caution. Pike walked up the porch steps like he owned the place. "You called this meeting?" he said flatly. "So talk." Walter didn't flinch. He simply nodded toward the field. "Thought we might have the conversation out back. Fresh air's good for honesty." The men hesitated, but followed. As they rounded the barn, the quiet exploded into action. 2 unmarked SUVs shot down the drive. State agents and windbreakers fanned out like a sudden tide, weapons drawn but lowered. Behind them, Nora arrived with a news crew in tow, camera rolling before the officials could process what was happening. Pike spun toward Walter. "You son of a—" Walter raised his hand, holding the badge of Aaron Blake high, the dull brass glinting in the pale light. "Sheriff Blake died trying to bring justice to this county," Walter said, his voice firm but steady. "And your family helped bury him." The agents closed in. Miles and Elaine went pale. Pike reached for something inside his coat, but before his hand could move farther, Buddy stepped forward. The pig, massive and deliberate, planted himself between Pike and Walter with a low, guttural grunt that stopped Pike cold. "You brought a pig to a gunfight?" Pike scoffed, eyes wild. Walter didn't smile. "He brought me to the truth. You brought the lies." The arrest was clean. Pike resisted for a heartbeat too long and was rewarded with cuffs biting into his wrists. The agents read him his rights as the camera rolled. Miles and Elaine were escorted quietly to separate vehicles. No one said much. Buddy stood like a stone the whole time. When the yard was quiet again, Nora approached, visibly shaken but resolute. "That's national news right there," she said, nodding toward the van. "This will be everywhere by tonight." Walter looked down at the badge still in his hand. "About time?" They walked back toward the house together, Buddy trailing close behind. As they reached the porch, Nora turned and said, "You know this is just the start, right? There are going to be more names, more pressure. Some of them still have reach." Walter nodded. "Let 'em reach. I've got files in 6 different places. A flash drive in a safety deposit box. A digital backup with Caroline's cousin in Cheyenne. Hell, even Buddy probably knows where the rest is." Nora laughed softly, then looked at Buddy with genuine awe. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, Walter. But I've never seen a pig solve a murder." Walter glanced down at the old hog, now flopped comfortably on the porch steps like it was just another Sunday morning. "Neither had I," he said. "But then again, I'd never had a reason to listen before." That night, Walter sat by the fire with a glass of bourbon and a quiet heart. The ranch felt lighter somehow, as if the ghosts had begun to shift beneath the soil, no longer restless. He looked out at the pen, then the barn, then to where Blake's remains rested temporarily beneath a tarp-covered patch, waiting for a proper burial. He raised his glass toward Buddy, who lay snoring softly in the doorway. "Justice, old friend," he said. "Took 100 years, but we got there." The funeral was quiet, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Sheriff Aaron Blake's remains were finally laid to rest beneath an open Wyoming sky, not far from the edge of Walter Grady's ranch, where wildflowers now bloomed where secrets once festered. A fresh white headstone marked his name, etched simply, "Aaron Blake, Sheriff. Died in service 1922, found 2025. A state trooper in dress uniform folded a flag with solemn hands, and when he presented it to no widow or child, he placed it gently atop the marker, as if honoring the soul itself. Walter stood off to the side in his worn boots and cleanest flannel shirt, hat in hand. He wasn't one for speeches, but people kept thanking him. The governor had sent a letter. The attorney general called it a triumph of truth over time. But Walter knew none of it would have happened without a pig who refused to stop digging. After the service, Nora joined him by the trailhead, where a new sign stood: the Aaron Blake Memorial Trail, a path to the truth. It wound through a section of the Grady Ranch that Walter had quietly donated, 20 acres of the very land once bought with blood money. Now, it would be a place for remembrance, for honesty, for walking into the future without forgetting the past. "You ever think this'd be how it ends?" Nora asked. Walter shook his head slowly. Never thought it'd begin. Buddy had become something of a legend in the weeks that followed. News outlets from New York to San Diego ran stories titled, "The Pig That Solved a Century-Old Murder," and "Justice Has Hooves." Children drew pictures of Buddy in crayon. A local brewery released a limited edition pale ale called Diggin' Buddy. A filmmaker even reached out about a documentary. Walter kept none of the attention. He stayed on the ranch, tended to the cattle, and spoke at a few rural law enforcement conferences when invited. Each time he brought the badge and a photo of Buddy lying beside the pit, calm as ever, like he'd been waiting for the world to finally catch up. Buddy, for his part, seemed content. He stopped digging entirely. No more scratching at corners or pacing the barn. He took to lying on the porch most afternoons, eyes half-lidded, as if he finally had peace. Years passed, slow and steady. Walter aged, his joints stiffened. He cut down the herd, took on less work. Sadie passed quietly one fall morning, curled up under the kitchen table. Buddy followed not long after, 14 years old by then. Walter found him one morning lying peacefully in his usual spot near the steps, the sun warming his old, bristled hide. Walter buried him beside the trail. No speeches, no cameras, just him, a shovel, and a pocket-sized replica of Sheriff Blake's badge, which he placed carefully in the dirt beside Buddy's heart. "You earned this more than most men ever did," he said softly. Time moved forward. Investigations expanded across the state. Other names on the list were tried, disgraced, stripped of their titles. Property was seized. Trust was rebuilt. What had once been buried beneath silence now lived in sunlight. People came from all over to walk the trail, some to learn, others just to see where a pig named Buddy changed everything. Children left little toy pigs at the memorial. Some adults left folded notes. One simply read, "Thank you for not staying silent." Walter remained at the ranch, not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Every evening, he sat on the porch with a glass in hand, watching the land breathe and sway beneath the sky Caroline once loved. Sometimes he'd talk aloud, as if Buddy were still there. "You know," he'd say, "they always thought you were just a pig." He'd pause, smile faintly. "But you were a compass." On the 5th anniversary of the case, the state unveiled a bronze statue at the head of the trail. A life-sized pig, mid-step, eyes forward. At its base, the plaque read, "In memory of Buddy, who dug up the truth." Walter didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, he stayed home and cooked a small supper, left a chair empty beside him, and let the wind carry his thoughts to wherever legends go. Sometimes justice takes a century to arrive. And sometimes it shows up with hooves, a snout, and a heart that just won't give up. Walter and Buddy's story reminds us that truth always finds a way to the light, often in the most unexpected places. What hidden histories or quiet acts of heroism have shaped your family or community? Share your own stories in the comments below. We believe every life holds a powerful narrative, and we'd love to hear yours. And if Buddy's tale touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more true stories of resilience and everyday heroes from across the American West. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.